Let me ask you something, and I want you to consider it slowly. Have you ever noticed how certain numbers seem to appear again and again throughout history, religion, science, and even within the structure of the human body? One of those numbers is 33. It surfaces in ancient traditions, in sacred architecture, in religious symbolism, and in the language of secret societies. Most people encounter the number only as a curiosity, a mysterious reference that seems to hint at hidden power. Yet very few people pause long enough to ask a more important question. What if the number was never meant to describe power over others, but power over oneself? Many people believe that the 33rd degree refers to a title inside an exclusive organization, a rank achieved by a small group of individuals who supposedly gain access to secret knowledge. Stories like that are fascinating, but they often distract from something much more profound. Symbols in ancient traditions rarely pointed toward external authority. They were almost always designed to describe inner transformation. The deeper meaning of the 33rd degree does not refer to a social status, a political hierarchy, or a hidden institution. It refers to a state of awareness that a human being can reach through understanding and discipline. To see why this idea appears in so many places, you need to look at something simple and familiar: your own spine. The human spine contains 33 vertebrae. These bones form the central axis of the body, the structure that supports movement, balance, and coordination. Ancient philosophical traditions often used the spine as a symbolic representation of consciousness itself. They imagined awareness rising through the spine like energy moving up a ladder. At the base lies survival, instinct, and reaction. This is where most people spend their lives, responding automatically to circumstances, reacting emotionally to events, and chasing whatever promises comfort or approval. But as awareness rises through this symbolic ladder, something begins to change. A person gradually moves from reaction toward observation. Instead of being pushed around by circumstances, they begin to notice their own thoughts. Instead of being controlled by emotion, they begin to understand it. Slowly, awareness becomes more deliberate. Choices become more conscious. Life stops feeling like a chaotic stream of events and begins to resemble something that can be shaped. In many ancient teachings, the number 33 became associated with the highest point of that ascent. It represents the moment when awareness reaches the top of the inner ladder. This does not mean perfection, nor does it imply supernatural ability. It means something quieter and far more practical. It means the individual has learned to observe their own mind clearly enough that they are no longer completely controlled by it. The symbolism of 33 also appears in religious narratives. According to tradition, Jesus was 33 years old at the time of the crucifixion. Whether one interprets that story historically or symbolically, the pattern remains striking. The crucifixion represents the death of the limited self, the identity built from fear, pride, social expectations, and the constant need for approval. In the language of symbolism, that death is followed by resurrection. Resurrection represents the birth of a new level of awareness, a way of seeing life that is no longer trapped inside the narrow boundaries of ego. The same symbolic pattern appears across many traditions: death followed by rebirth, descent followed by ascent, darkness followed by illumination. These stories are not simply describing historical events. They are describing psychological transformations that human beings have experienced throughout history. The 33rd degree, in this sense, marks the transition between two different modes of living. The first mode is unconscious living. In this state, a person reacts automatically to the world around them. Their mood depends on the behavior of others. Their confidence rises and falls with external success. They look outward for validation, approval, and direction. Life feels unpredictable because their inner world is constantly responding to whatever appears outside. The second mode is conscious living. In this state, a person begins to observe the patterns inside their own mind. They notice how thoughts create emotional reactions. They see how emotional reactions influence decisions. Over time, they begin to understand how repeated decisions slowly construct the shape of an entire life. This realization introduces a quiet but powerful shift. Instead of drifting through events, the individual begins to participate in them deliberately. Ancient traditions sometimes describe this shift using the language of initiation. The initiate was not someone who had been given secret information. The initiate was someone who had begun to see clearly. They recognized that attention has power. They understood that habits shape identity. They noticed that awareness itself could be directed. The contrast between the initiate and the ordinary person was never meant as a judgment. The word profane in ancient language simply meant someone standing outside the temple. In symbolic terms, the temple represented self-knowledge. The profane person lives outside that inner temple. Their attention moves wherever the world pushes it. They absorb opinions, fears, and desires from their environment without questioning them. The initiate enters the temple of observation. They watch their own reactions with curiosity. They notice how quickly the mind forms assumptions, how easily emotions rise and fall, how often thoughts repeat themselves. This observation begins to reveal patterns that were previously invisible. The same arguments repeat. The same fears appear in different forms. The same desires return again and again. Recognizing those patterns is the beginning of freedom. Once you see them clearly, you are no longer completely inside them. A small distance appears between the observer and the reaction. In that space, something remarkable becomes possible. Choice. Choice rarely feels dramatic at first. It appears quietly, a moment where anger could erupt. Yet something pauses, a moment where doubt begins to speak. Yet something listens without immediately believing it. These small moments of awareness gradually reshape the way a person moves through the world. Over time, this inner shift changes the experience of reality itself. Circumstances still happen. Successes still come and go. Challenges still appear. The difference lies in the center from which a person responds. Instead of reacting automatically, they respond with awareness. Instead of being carried by emotional currents, they begin to steer. For this reason, ancient philosophers often insisted that true power begins inside the mind. Someone who cannot guide their own attention will always be guided by the attention of others. Someone who cannot observe their emotions will always be driven by them. But the person who learns to watch their thoughts without immediately becoming them begins to experience a stability that is difficult to disturb. That stability is the quiet threshold represented by the symbol of the 33rd degree, not a badge, not a secret society rank, not an external achievement. A shift in awareness that gradually transforms the relationship between a person and their own mind. Let me show you something that most people move through life without ever noticing. There is an invisible line that runs quietly through human experience. You cannot see it with your eyes, and no institution officially marks where it exists. Yet once you recognize it, the difference becomes unmistakable. On one side of that line stand those who live entirely within the noise of the world. On the other side stand those who have begun to observe that noise rather than be carried by it. Ancient traditions describe this difference using two words, the profane and the initiate. The word profane has often been misunderstood. In its original sense, it did not mean immoral or sinful. It simply meant someone standing outside the temple. The temple, in symbolic language, did not refer to a building made of stone. It referred to the inner space of self-knowledge. A profane person lives outside that inner temple because their attention is constantly directed outward. Their sense of identity is shaped by what others think of them. Their emotions rise and fall with every external event. News headlines, opinions on social media, the success or failure of others, each of these becomes a force that pushes and pulls their inner state. You have probably seen this pattern countless times. Someone wakes up feeling calm, but a message arrives and suddenly the entire mood of the day changes. A conversation shifts their confidence. A criticism lingers in the mind for hours. Their inner world becomes a mirror, reflecting whatever happens around them. The profane life is not defined by ignorance in the intellectual sense. It is defined by the absence of observation. The mind reacts. The emotions follow. And the person moves through the day without realizing that this chain of events is happening automatically. Now the initiate lives in the same world. The same events occur. The same messages arrive. The same circumstances appear. The difference is not the environment. The difference is awareness. The initiate has begun to notice the movement of their own mind. They recognize the moment when a reaction begins forming. They feel the surge of emotion before it fully takes control. Instead of immediately becoming that reaction, they watch it. This simple act of observation changes everything. Observation introduces distance. When a person is completely identified with their thoughts, every idea feels like a command, and every emotion feels like a fact. But the moment observation appears, the experience shifts. A thought becomes something that passes through the mind, rather than something that defines the person. An emotion becomes a signal rather than a dictator. This small gap between awareness and reaction is where freedom begins to take shape. Ancient schools of philosophy often described initiation as a doorway rather than a destination. No ceremony could grant it permanently. No title could guarantee it. The doorway opens when a person begins to see themselves clearly. That clarity often arrives through quiet moments of reflection. Perhaps you have experienced something like it before, a moment when you suddenly notice how repetitive certain patterns in your life have become. The same arguments return in different forms. The same doubts reappear when new opportunities arise. The same emotional reactions surface in situations that seem completely unrelated. Recognizing these patterns can be uncomfortable. It reveals how much of life has been operating on autopilot. Yet that discomfort carries an unexpected gift. When patterns become visible, they also become changeable. What once felt inevitable begins to look like a habit that can be observed and gradually reshaped. The initiate understands that attention is the most valuable resource a human being possesses. Wherever attention goes, energy follows. If attention is scattered across endless distractions, the mind becomes fragmented. Thoughts multiply without direction. Emotions fluctuate constantly. A person in this state may feel busy, even overwhelmed, yet nothing inside truly stabilizes. The initiate begins to guard attention carefully. They notice which conversations drain it and which activities strengthen it. They observe how quickly the mind can be pulled into arguments, comparisons, and fears that have little real substance. This awareness changes how they move through the world. Conversations become more deliberate. Silence becomes more comfortable. There is less urgency to react to every opinion or prove every point. The initiate does not withdraw from life. Rather, they participate with greater clarity. Instead of being absorbed by every external influence, they choose which influences deserve space in their mind. Another difference begins to appear in the way time is experienced. The profane mind is constantly pulled between regret and anticipation. It revisits past mistakes, replaying them repeatedly as though the mind could rewrite what has already happened. Then it leaps forward into imagined futures filled with worry or expectation. The present moment becomes merely a bridge between those two directions. The initiate begins to notice this habit. Gradually, they learn to return attention to the present more often, not because the past and future cease to exist, but because real action can only occur now. This shift might appear subtle from the outside, yet its consequences are significant. When attention settles in the present, awareness sharpens, decisions become clearer. The mind stops racing long enough to see what is actually happening rather than what the imagination fears might happen. Over time, this clarity builds confidence that does not rely on constant reassurance from others. There is also a quiet humility in the mindset of the initiate. Observing the mind reveals how easily thoughts can be mistaken for truth and how often emotions distort perception. This recognition softens the need to appear certain about everything. Instead of clinging to rigid opinions, the initiate becomes curious. Curiosity replaces defensiveness. Questions replace automatic conclusions. This is why initiation has always been described as an inward journey. It does not require leaving society, abandoning responsibilities, or adopting elaborate rituals. It begins with something much simpler, learning to watch the movements of one's own consciousness. Each time observation replaces automatic reaction, the boundary between the profane and the initiate shifts slightly. Over months and years, those small shifts accumulate. Reactions become responses. Noise becomes information. The mind becomes less like a storm and more like a clear sky through which thoughts and emotions move without leaving permanent traces. Life continues unfolding with all its complexity. Yet the center from which one experiences it becomes steadier. At first glance, the two lives may appear identical from the outside. Both individuals walk through the same streets, face the same uncertainties, and encounter the same opportunities. The difference lies in the inner posture from which each moment is met. One moves through the world as a mirror reflecting every external influence. The other moves through it as an observer who has begun to recognize the architecture of the mind itself. Let me bring your attention to something you may have experienced many times without realizing what was actually happening. Imagine that you have an idea, something meaningful, something you feel genuinely excited about. Maybe it is a plan, a project, a change you want to make in your life. At first, the idea feels alive inside you. There is energy behind it. You imagine possibilities. You feel momentum building. And for a moment it seems as though something important is about to begin. Then you share the idea with someone. You explain it in detail. You describe what you are going to do. And you speak about it with enthusiasm. Strangely, after that conversation, something changes. The energy that once felt so vivid begins to fade. The plan that seemed powerful only hours before now feels distant, almost optional. What happened in that moment? Ancient Hermetic traditions described a principle that quietly explains this phenomenon. They called it the law of silence. According to this teaching, every idea carries a certain amount of creative energy. When a thought is still forming, that energy is concentrated. It gathers quietly inside the mind, building potential. But when the idea is spoken too soon, the energy that belongs to creation begins to dissipate through expression. Words release the pressure that would otherwise push the idea into action. Modern psychology has observed something similar. When people talk extensively about their plans before taking real steps toward them, the brain sometimes interprets the conversation as partial completion. Social recognition produces a small reward response, a burst of satisfaction that mimics the feeling of achievement. The mind receives the signal that progress has already occurred, even though the work has not yet begun. As a result, motivation weakens. The idea loses urgency. This is one reason many ancient teachers emphasized restraint in speech. Silence was never meant as repression or secrecy for its own sake. It was understood as a method of conserving power. Words carry energy. When they are used carefully, they can guide attention and shape reality. When they are scattered without intention, they drain the same energy that could have been directed toward meaningful action. You can observe this principle in everyday life. Think about how often people announce their goals publicly long before they take the first real step. They describe what they intend to become, what they will accomplish, how they will change their circumstances. Yet weeks later, the same conversations repeat themselves, almost unchanged. The idea continues to exist mainly in the realm of speech. The initiate recognizes this pattern and begins to move differently. Instead of speaking immediately, they allow the idea to remain within the mind long enough to develop strength. Silence creates space for refinement. When a thought remains unspoken, it evolves quietly. The mind examines it from different angles. Weak points become visible. Practical steps begin to appear. Gradually, the idea transforms from a vague desire into a structure capable of supporting action. By the time the initiate finally speaks about it, if they choose to speak at all, the idea is already moving toward reality. There is another dimension to this law that is even more subtle. Silence protects intention from unnecessary influence. The moment a plan is shared widely, it becomes exposed to the expectations, doubts, and projections of others. Some people will respond with encouragement, others with skepticism, and many with opinions shaped by their own fears or limitations. Even when those reactions are well-intentioned, they introduce noise into the mind of the person who originally conceived the idea. Doubt can enter quietly through conversation. Confidence can weaken under the weight of external judgment. By maintaining silence during the early stages of creation, the initiate shields the fragile beginning of an idea from this interference. The concept is allowed to grow in a protected space, much like a seed developing beneath the surface of soil. Seeds do not reveal themselves immediately. They gather strength in darkness before pushing upward into the light. Ideas behave in a similar way. They require a period of quiet formation before they are strong enough to exist openly. Silence also transforms the way a person listens. When the habit of constant speech fades, attention naturally shifts toward observation. Conversations become clearer. The motivations behind words become easier to detect. Instead of waiting impatiently for the opportunity to respond, the initiate hears what is actually being said. This ability to listen deeply reveals patterns in human behavior that often remain invisible to those who speak continuously. Over time, silence becomes more than a strategy. It becomes a form of inner discipline. The mind grows comfortable with pauses that once felt uncomfortable. Moments of quiet no longer create anxiety. In that stillness, thoughts settle and perception sharpens. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions begin to unfold more slowly. The space between stimulus and response widens just enough for awareness to enter. From the outside, this change may appear subtle. The initiate does not withdraw from conversation or avoid interaction with others. They simply speak with greater intention. Words become deliberate rather than automatic. Instead of filling every silence with commentary, they allow certain moments to remain quiet. This quiet carries a different quality of presence. People often sense it even if they cannot explain why. There is a particular kind of strength that develops through this practice. When speech is restrained, actions begin to carry more weight. Promises are made carefully and fulfilled consistently. Opinions are offered less frequently but with greater clarity. Over time, others learn that when this person speaks, their words are worth hearing. Authority emerges naturally from the alignment between speech and action. The conservation of power through silence extends beyond ideas and conversations. It also affects emotional energy. Reacting instantly to every criticism, argument, or provocation consumes enormous amounts of attention. The initiate begins to recognize how much energy is lost in these exchanges. By choosing silence in certain moments, they preserve their focus for what truly matters. This does not mean suppressing emotion or ignoring important issues. It means recognizing that not every impulse requires expression. Some reactions dissolve naturally when given space. Others reveal their true nature only after a period of reflection. Silence allows the mind to examine emotion without immediately projecting it outward. Gradually, the relationship between thought, speech, and action becomes more balanced. Ideas are allowed to grow before they are shared. Words are chosen with care rather than habit. Attention remains centered instead of scattering in every direction. The result is a quiet accumulation of strength that others may notice long before they understand its source. For this reason, the Hermetic law of silence was never simply about saying less. It was about recognizing the subtle connection between attention, language, and creative power. When speech becomes intentional, energy gathers instead of dispersing. When attention remains focused, ideas develop depth instead of fading into distraction. The initiate begins to understand that silence is not emptiness at all, but a space where potential quietly organizes itself into form. Every meaningful vision begins in a place that no one else can see, long before the world recognizes it, before results appear, before proof exists. An idea forms quietly inside the mind. In that early moment, the vision carries tremendous potential, yet it also carries a certain fragility. It has not yet developed roots. It has not yet faced resistance. It is still shaping itself, still searching for structure. What happens during this stage often determines whether the vision will grow into reality or dissolve into another forgotten intention. Many people unknowingly weaken their own vision at the exact moment it begins to appear. The moment inspiration arrives, they feel the urge to speak about it immediately. They share the plan with friends, explain it to colleagues, describe it in detail, and sometimes even announce it publicly. The intention behind this impulse is understandable. Speaking about a dream feels exciting. It creates the sense that something important is happening. Yet the mind does not always distinguish between describing a vision and actually building it. When a plan is spoken too early, the psychological effect can be subtle but powerful. The conversation itself produces a feeling of progress. The mind receives attention, feedback, sometimes praise. This recognition triggers a small sense of satisfaction, as if a step toward the goal has already been completed. Yet in reality, nothing has been constructed. No structure has been built. No obstacle has been overcome. The energy that was meant to drive action has partially discharged through speech. Ancient traditions understood this phenomenon long before modern psychology began studying it. They taught that vision must pass through a period of incubation. During this time, the idea grows silently inside the mind, developing strength before it is exposed to the external world. This incubation is not passive. It is a process of quiet refinement. The individual examines the idea repeatedly, testing it against reality, shaping it into something that can survive outside the imagination. When a vision remains protected during this stage, something important begins to happen. The mind starts organizing itself around the idea. Thoughts that once felt scattered gradually align with the direction of the vision. Practical steps begin to appear. Solutions surface naturally as the brain searches for ways to translate imagination into action. What once felt like an abstract desire begins transforming into a sequence of achievable movements. But when the vision is exposed too early, another influence enters the process: the minds of other people. Every person who hears your plan interprets it through the lens of their own experience. Someone who has never attempted something similar may see only difficulty. Someone who has failed at a related endeavor may project their disappointment onto your idea. Even supportive voices can introduce expectations that subtly reshape the original vision. This does not mean that people intentionally sabotage the dreams of others. Most reactions come from genuine concern or personal perspective. Yet the human mind absorbs these signals more deeply than it realizes. Doubt does not always appear as a loud objection. Sometimes it enters quietly through a simple remark, a raised eyebrow, a cautious suggestion. A small question can linger in the mind long after the conversation ends. The initiate understands this vulnerability. Protecting a vision is not about secrecy for its own sake. It is about recognizing that ideas require time to develop internal strength. Just as a young plant must remain sheltered until its roots are established, a new vision must grow privately until it becomes resilient enough to withstand external opinions. During this protected phase, the relationship between imagination and action becomes clearer. The initiate does not simply dream about the future. They begin translating the vision into small, deliberate movements. Instead of speaking about the plan repeatedly, they quietly build the first pieces of it. Each completed step strengthens confidence. Because progress is no longer theoretical, it becomes visible in tangible form. This approach produces a very different kind of momentum. When the vision eventually becomes visible to others, it no longer exists only as an idea. Evidence of its existence already stands in the world. The conversation changes naturally because the plan is no longer dependent on approval. The work itself begins to speak. Another advantage emerges during this silent phase of creation. Without the noise of external opinions, the individual develops a stronger connection to their own intuition. The mind learns to listen inwardly rather than constantly seeking reassurance from others. Decisions become more grounded. Direction becomes clearer. Instead of moving according to the expectations of the environment, the initiate begins moving according to an inner sense of alignment. This does not mean that collaboration or feedback is unnecessary. There comes a stage when sharing the vision becomes beneficial. At that point, the idea has matured enough to benefit from external perspectives. Advice can strengthen the structure rather than destabilize it. The difference lies in the timing. Once the vision possesses its own foundation, it no longer depends entirely on the fragile energy of imagination. Many of the most significant creations in history followed this pattern. They began quietly, often unnoticed by the surrounding world. Their creators spent long periods refining the vision before revealing it. When the moment of exposure arrived, the work had already taken shape. What appeared to others as sudden success was actually the result of long preparation hidden beneath the surface. The practice of guarding a vision gradually changes how a person relates to their own ambitions. Dreams become less about public declaration and more about personal responsibility. The individual learns to value progress over recognition, structure over excitement, quiet persistence over immediate validation. Over time, this discipline transforms the entire process of creation. Instead of scattering attention through constant explanation, the initiate gathers attention into focused action. Instead of defending ideas through argument, They allow results to emerge naturally. Instead of chasing approval, they allow the work itself to reveal its purpose. A vision protected during its earlier stage develops a kind of quiet resilience. By the time it stands in the open world, it is no longer fragile. It carries the strength of patience, the clarity of reflection, and the momentum of consistent action. At that point, it no longer needs protection. It simply continues growing. There is a phrase that appears again and again in ancient philosophy, in symbolic traditions, and in systems of self-mastery: ordo ab chao, order out of chaos. At first glance, it sounds like a poetic motto, something decorative that belongs on the walls of old institutions or hidden inside the language of secret societies. Yet the meaning behind it is not mystical at all. It describes one of the most fundamental patterns of reality itself. Chaos is the default condition of the world. Order is something that must be created. Look around any environment that is left unattended for long enough. A room slowly fills with clutter. A garden becomes overgrown with weeds. A system that once worked efficiently begins to break down. This process does not require effort. Disorder happens naturally. It is the direction things move when no conscious force intervenes. Order, on the other hand, always demands attention, structure, and intention. Without those elements, even the most carefully organized system eventually collapses back into confusion. The same principle applies to the human mind. If attention is left completely undirected, thoughts scatter in every possible direction. One moment the mind replays an argument from yesterday. The next moment it worries about something that may happen next week. Then it drifts toward comparison, memory, anxiety, distraction. The mind becomes a stream of impulses rather than a tool of clarity. Many people assume this mental chaos is simply the natural condition of being human. In reality, it is what happens when awareness is not actively shaping the structure of thought. Ancient teachers understood that mastering life begins with mastering this relationship between chaos and order. They did not attempt to eliminate chaos entirely. Chaos contains creativity, movement, and possibility. Without it, nothing new could ever appear. But they recognized that chaos without structure quickly becomes destructive. The role of consciousness is to organize that raw energy into patterns that support growth. The initiate therefore approaches life differently from the person who simply reacts to circumstances. Instead of waiting for the external world to become stable, they begin by establishing order within themselves. This inner structure gradually spreads outward into the environment. Habits become more deliberate. Time becomes more intentional. Attention becomes more focused. The external world begins to reflect the internal organization that has been created. One of the first places this transformation becomes visible is in the relationship with daily routines. A chaotic mind often moves through the day without any clear structure. Tasks are postponed. Distractions multiply, and important work becomes buried beneath urgent but meaningless activity. The day feels busy, yet little of real value is accomplished. The initiate recognizes that time is not simply something that passes, it is something that must be arranged. Creating order in time begins with simple decisions: waking at a consistent hour, setting aside uninterrupted periods for meaningful work, completing tasks before seeking entertainment. These actions may appear small, yet they gradually reshape the rhythm of life. When repeated consistently, they form a framework that supports concentration and discipline. Order also extends into the physical environment. The spaces where a person lives and works influence the clarity of their mind more than they often realize. A disorganized environment constantly pulls attention in multiple directions. Objects compete for focus. Small frustrations accumulate throughout the day. Over time, this background noise weakens the ability to think clearly. When the environment becomes organized, the mind responds almost immediately. Attention settles more easily. Decisions become simpler. The initiate therefore treats order as a form of mental hygiene. Just as the body requires care to remain healthy, the mind requires structure to remain effective. Clearing unnecessary clutter, arranging tools deliberately, maintaining a sense of simplicity in one's surroundings, these actions reinforce the internal discipline that supports creative work. Another dimension of Ordo Ab Chao appears in the management of emotional energy. Emotions themselves are not chaotic in a negative sense. They are signals that carry information about how we experience the world. Yet when emotions move without awareness, they easily dominate behavior. Anger becomes reaction, fear becomes avoidance, excitement becomes impulsive decisions. The initiate does not attempt to suppress emotion, but they introduce observation into the process. Instead of allowing emotions to dictate action immediately, they pause long enough to understand what the emotion is revealing. This pause introduces a layer of order into the emotional landscape. Rather than being swept away by every internal impulse, the individual begins to navigate those impulses consciously. Decisions become aligned with intention rather than driven by momentary reactions. The principle of creating order from chaos also applies to knowledge itself. In the modern world, information arrives from every direction at once. News, opinion, data, analysis, commentary. An endless stream flows through digital networks every hour of the day. Without a system for organizing this information, the mind becomes overwhelmed. The initiate develops the ability to filter what enters their attention. They choose sources carefully, absorb ideas slowly, and reflect on what they learn before forming conclusions. This filtering process prevents the mind from becoming a container for endless noise. Instead, it becomes a structure capable of holding understanding. The difference between these two states is profound. A mind filled with scattered information struggles to produce clarity. A mind that organizes knowledge deliberately can apply that knowledge with precision. Over time, the discipline of creating order begins to transform the experience of life itself. Situations that once felt overwhelming become manageable because the individual has developed systems for responding to complexity. Problems are broken into smaller parts. Solutions are tested patiently. Progress appears gradually but steadily. From the outside, this process may look simple. The initiate wakes at a consistent time, organizes their environment, plans their work, and reflects before reacting emotionally. None of these actions seem dramatic. Yet, their combined effect produces something powerful: stability. Stability allows creativity to flourish without collapsing into confusion. It allows ambition to grow without turning into chaos. The phrase ordo ab chao therefore describes more than a philosophical concept. It describes a method of living. Instead of waiting for life to become orderly on its own, the individual accepts responsibility for shaping that order through conscious effort. Every small act of organization strengthens the ability to guide larger forces. Gradually, the relationship between chaos and order begins to change. Chaos no longer appears as a threat that must be avoided. It becomes the raw material from which structure can be created. Ideas emerge from uncertainty. Challenges reveal new possibilities. And the unpredictable movement of life becomes something that can be shaped rather than feared. Through this practice, the initiate begins to see that order is not imposed on life from the outside. It grows from within awareness itself, quietly arranging experience into patterns that support clarity, direction, and deliberate movement. A powerful life is rarely the result of sudden inspiration. It is almost always the result of structure. Beneath every visible success, beneath every moment that appears effortless from the outside, there is usually an invisible architecture made of discipline, habits, and carefully shaped environments. Without this structure, even the most ambitious vision eventually collapses under the weight of distraction and inconsistency. Many people misunderstand the word discipline. They imagine it as a form of harsh self-control, something rigid that removes freedom from life. Yet real discipline does the opposite. It creates freedom by reducing chaos. When certain behaviors become stable habits, the mind no longer wastes energy debating the same decisions every day. Energy that would have been consumed by hesitation becomes available for creativity, learning, and meaningful work. Think about how much mental energy disappears through small daily decisions. When to wake up, when to begin working, when to exercise, when to focus, and when to rest. If each of these decisions must be negotiated repeatedly, the mind gradually becomes exhausted. Discipline eliminates much of that negotiation. Once a routine is established, the decision has already been made. The mind simply follows the structure that has been created. This is why many of the most effective individuals in history developed very simple but consistent daily rhythms. They woke at similar hours each day. They reserved specific blocks of time for focused work. They protected certain periods from distraction. Over time, these rhythms became the framework through which their creative energy could move. Instead of relying on motivation, they relied on structure. Motivation is unpredictable. Some days it appears naturally, bringing enthusiasm and momentum. On other days, it disappears completely. When action depends only on motivation, progress becomes inconsistent. Discipline provides something more reliable. It allows action to continue even when inspiration is quiet. The individual does not wait for the perfect emotional state. They begin working because the structure of their life already points them in that direction. Environment plays an equally important role in this architecture. Human behavior is deeply influenced by surroundings, often in ways that go unnoticed. A cluttered environment encourages distraction. A space filled with noise fragments attention. Objects placed within reach silently guide habits. A phone lying on a desk invites constant checking. A television glowing in the background competes for awareness even when no one intends to watch it. The initiate, therefore, treats the environment as an extension of the mind. Instead of allowing surroundings to develop randomly, they arrange them deliberately. Workspaces become clear and functional. Tools are placed where they can be accessed easily. Unnecessary objects are removed. These adjustments may appear small, yet they quietly reduce friction in everyday actions. When the environment supports the desired behavior, discipline requires less effort. Consider the difference between attempting to work in a room filled with distractions and working in a space designed for concentration. In the first situation, the mind must constantly resist temptation. In the second, the environment naturally encourages focus. Over time, these subtle influences accumulate. What once required intense willpower becomes part of an ordinary routine. The architecture of a powerful life also includes boundaries. Modern life constantly demands attention. Messages arrive at all hours. News updates compete for awareness. Social platforms are designed to capture focus repeatedly throughout the day. Without boundaries, attention becomes fragmented into countless small pieces. Each interruption weakens concentration and reduces the depth of thinking. Discipline introduces protective boundaries around attention. Certain hours are reserved for uninterrupted work. Notifications are silenced. Communication happens intentionally rather than continuously. These boundaries are not signs of isolation. They are signs of clarity about what deserves attention and what does not. Another dimension of discipline appears in the way a person handles discomfort. Growth rarely occurs inside perfect comfort. Learning requires effort. Building something meaningful requires persistence through uncertainty. The initiate understands that discomfort is not always a signal to stop. Sometimes it is simply evidence that the mind is stretching beyond familiar limits. Instead of avoiding difficulty, they learn to work alongside it. A challenging task is approached step by step rather than abandoned at the first sign of resistance. Over time, this approach strengthens resilience. The mind becomes less reactive to temporary frustration. Problems that once felt overwhelming begin to appear manageable because the individual has practiced remaining steady in the presence of challenge. Physical habits also contribute to the structure of discipline. The body influences the mind more directly than many people realize. Sleep patterns affect concentration. Movement affects mood. Nutrition influences clarity of thought. When the body is neglected, mental energy becomes unstable. Fatigue, irritation, and distraction appear more frequently. Caring for the body, therefore, becomes part of maintaining the architecture of a focused life. The initiate does not pursue perfection in these areas. Instead, they pursue consistency. Regular sleep, moderate exercise, and periods of rest create a stable foundation for sustained effort. Over months and years, this stability supports levels of productivity that would otherwise be impossible. All of these elements, routine, environment, boundaries, resilience, and physical care, combine to form the architecture that supports long-term achievement. None of them appear dramatic on their own. There is no sudden moment where discipline announces itself with great intensity. Instead, it reveals its power gradually through the accumulation of small actions repeated with intention. Many people search for extraordinary methods that promise rapid transformation, yet the most reliable transformation emerges from ordinary practices applied consistently. A structured morning, a focused hour of work, an organized space, a boundary around attention. These habits quietly shape the direction of an entire life. Over time, the architecture becomes self-reinforcing. The more discipline strengthens the environment, the easier it becomes to maintain discipline. The clearer the environment becomes, the easier it becomes to think clearly. Each element supports the others. Progress begins to feel natural rather than forced. Eventually, something subtle changes inside the individual. Discipline no longer feels like restriction. It feels like alignment. Actions begin to follow intention almost automatically. Energy flows toward meaningful work instead of scattering across endless distractions. From the outside, this life may appear calm, even ordinary. Yet beneath that calm structure lies a powerful system that steadily converts attention into progress. The architecture remains largely invisible, though its effects continue shaping everything built upon it. Across many ancient temples and symbolic traditions, there appears a striking pattern beneath the feet of those who enter, a floor made of alternating black and white squares. This design is often called the mosaic pavement. At first glance, it seems decorative, almost simple. Yet for centuries it has carried a philosophical meaning that reaches far beyond architecture. The pattern represents one of the most fundamental truths about human experience. Reality is built upon the coexistence of opposites, light and darkness, success and failure, joy and sorrow, gain and loss. These pairs appear everywhere in life, not as accidents but as complementary forces that shape the rhythm of existence. The mosaic pavement symbolizes the ground upon which human life unfolds, reminding those who walk across it that no experience exists in isolation from its opposite. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid one side of this pattern. They seek pleasure while attempting to eliminate pain. They pursue success while fearing failure. They desire certainty while resisting uncertainty. Yet this constant attempt to separate opposites often creates more suffering than the experiences themselves. When discomfort appears, the mind interprets it as evidence that something has gone wrong. Instead of learning from the moment, the person begins fighting against it. The initiate begins to see the pattern differently. Instead of resisting the presence of opposites, they recognize that growth emerges precisely from their interaction. Consider how physical strength develops. Muscles do not grow in perfect comfort. They grow through resistance. Each time weight is lifted, microscopic strain occurs within the muscle fibers. The body responds by rebuilding those fibers stronger than before. Without resistance, strength would never appear. The same principle applies to psychological and emotional development. Confidence is not born from a life without challenges. It grows from encountering difficulty and discovering the ability to move through it. Wisdom rarely arrives through constant success. It emerges when mistakes reveal patterns that were previously invisible. Even creativity often arises from tension between opposing ideas. When the mosaic pavement is understood in this way, the meaning of life's contrasts begins to shift. Difficulty no longer appears as an interruption of progress. Instead, it becomes part of the process through which progress takes shape. The initiate learns to observe both sides of the pattern without becoming trapped by either one. This perspective also changes the relationship with success. Many people imagine success as a permanent state where difficulty disappears entirely, yet such a state would eliminate the very forces that allow growth to continue. Every new level of achievement introduces new challenges. Responsibilities expand, expectations increase, complexity deepens. The presence of these challenges is not a sign that success was temporary. It is evidence that the journey is continuing. Understanding the unity of opposites also brings balance to emotional experience. When a person believes that happiness must be constant, every moment of sadness feels like failure. When they expect life to remain stable, every change feels threatening. But when they recognize that emotional states move naturally between different poles, the intensity of those fluctuations begins to soften. Instead of clinging desperately to moments of joy or resisting moments of difficulty, the initiate allows both to pass through awareness. Each experience becomes information rather than identity. Joy can be appreciated fully without the fear that it must last forever. Difficulty can be observed without the belief that it will define the future. Another important insight emerges from this understanding. Opposites often exist within the same person at the same time. Courage and fear can coexist in the same moment. Compassion can exist alongside anger. Confidence can appear even while uncertainty remains. The human mind is not limited to a single emotional state. It is capable of holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. Many traditions refer to this process as integrating the shadow. The shadow represents those aspects of personality that people prefer not to acknowledge: impulses, emotions, or traits that conflict with the image they wish to present to the world. When these elements are denied or suppressed, they do not disappear. Instead, they operate unconsciously, influencing behavior in ways the person may not understand. The initiate approaches the shadow differently. Rather than rejecting these hidden aspects, they examine them carefully. Anger may reveal a boundary that needs protection. Fear may reveal an area where growth is necessary. Even traits that appear negative can contain energy that becomes constructive when understood and directed consciously. This does not mean embracing destructive behavior. It means recognizing that human nature contains a wide range of impulses. By acknowledging these impulses instead of denying them, a person gains the ability to guide them rather than be controlled by them. The mosaic pavement, therefore, represents more than philosophical balance. It represents psychological maturity. Walking across that symbolic floor means accepting that life contains both light and darkness, and that neither side can be removed without distorting the whole. Over time, this understanding produces a certain calmness. Situations that once triggered extreme reactions begin to feel less overwhelming. Success is appreciated without becoming intoxicating. Failure is examined without becoming paralyzing. The initiate stands at the center of the pattern rather than being thrown from one extreme to another. This balanced perspective also influences relationships with others. When someone understands the complexity within themselves, they become more patient with the complexity of other people. They recognize that every individual carries contradictions, strengths mixed with weaknesses, clarity mixed with confusion. Judgment becomes less immediate. Curiosity begins to replace criticism. From this viewpoint, the world itself begins to appear less divided. Many conflicts arise because individuals believe that only one side of a situation can be correct. Yet reality often contains elements of truth on multiple sides. Recognizing this complexity does not eliminate disagreement, but it opens the possibility of deeper understanding. The mosaic pavement remains beneath the feet of anyone who chooses to notice it. Its black and white pattern quietly reflects the structure of existence itself. Every step across it reminds the observer that opposites are not enemies fighting for dominance. They are complementary forces that give shape to experience. Seen from this perspective, life stops appearing as a struggle to eliminate darkness and preserve light forever. It begins to resemble a landscape where both elements coexist, each revealing meaning through its relationship with the other. In that landscape, awareness learns to move with steadiness across the shifting pattern beneath it. Every human being carries within them a hidden territory that is rarely spoken about openly. It is a place made of impulses, emotions, memories, and desires that do not always fit the image a person wishes to present to the world. Many people spend their lives trying to pretend this territory does not exist. They focus only on the qualities they consider admirable while quietly pushing everything else into the background. Yet what is hidden rarely disappears. It simply moves into the shadows of the mind, where it continues influencing behavior in ways that often go unnoticed. Psychologists have long referred to this hidden territory as the shadow. The shadow is not necessarily evil, nor is it purely negative. It is simply the collection of traits that a person has rejected, ignored, or suppressed because they conflict with their preferred identity. Anger that was never expressed, ambition that felt too bold to admit, fear that seemed embarrassing. Even talents or strengths may become part of the shadow if they were discouraged during early experiences. When these aspects remain hidden, they often appear indirectly. A person who believes they are always calm may suddenly erupt with unexpected anger. Someone who insists they are humble may secretly resent the success of others. Another person may criticize traits in others that they unknowingly possess themselves. In these moments, the shadow briefly surfaces, revealing something that has been operating beneath awareness. Most people respond to these moments by pushing the shadow away again. They deny it, rationalize it, or blame external circumstances. Yet this avoidance only strengthens the hidden influence of the shadow. What remains unseen cannot be guided. It acts automatically, shaping decisions and reactions without conscious participation. The initiate takes a different approach. Instead of rejecting the shadow, they begin to observe it with curiosity. This observation requires honesty, because the shadow rarely appears in comfortable forms. It may reveal impulses that feel unfamiliar or emotions that contradict the image a person prefers to hold about themselves. At first, this recognition can feel unsettling. Yet within that discomfort lies the beginning of a powerful transformation. When the shadow is examined carefully, it begins to reveal something important. Many of the qualities buried in the shadow contain energy that has simply been misdirected. Anger, for example, is often condemned as destructive. Yet at its core, anger is a signal that something important requires protection. When guided consciously, that same energy becomes courage or determination. Ambition may appear selfish when uncontrolled. Yet when balanced with awareness, it becomes the drive that pushes a person to create meaningful change. Even fear carries hidden information. Fear draws attention to areas where growth is possible. It highlights boundaries that have not yet been crossed and challenges that have not yet been faced. When fear is observed instead of avoided, it often becomes a compass pointing toward opportunities for expansion. Shadow integration does not mean acting on every impulse or embracing destructive behavior. It means acknowledging the presence of these inner forces and learning how to direct them. When a person recognizes the energy behind an emotion, they gain the ability to transform that energy into something constructive. This process begins with awareness. The initiate watches their reactions closely, especially in moments when emotions appear suddenly or intensely. Instead of asking, "Why did that happen to me?" they begin asking a different question: "What inside me responded in that way?" This shift redirects attention from external blame toward internal understanding. Gradually, patterns begin to appear. The same situations trigger similar reactions. Certain comments evoke strong emotional responses. Particular types of people create immediate attraction or resistance. Each pattern offers a clue about what lies within the shadow. The initiate studies these patterns not with judgment, but with curiosity. Through this observation, something interesting begins to happen. The energy that once erupted unpredictably becomes easier to recognize before it reaches that point. Anger appears as a rising sensation rather than an uncontrollable explosion. Fear appears as tension rather than paralysis. Awareness introduces a moment of space between emotion and action. Inside that space, choice becomes possible. The individual can decide how the energy will be expressed. Anger might transform into clear communication or decisive boundaries. Fear might become careful preparation rather than avoidance. Even jealousy can become a signal pointing toward desires that have not yet been pursued. As this process continues, the shadow gradually loses its mysterious power. What was once hidden becomes integrated into conscious identity. The individual no longer needs to pretend certain emotions do not exist. Instead, they understand those emotions as parts of the human experience that can be directed wisely. This integration also produces a deeper sense of authenticity. When people deny large portions of their emotional life, their behavior often becomes rigid. They must constantly maintain an image that hides the complexity beneath it. Once the shadow is acknowledged, that tension begins to dissolve. The individual becomes more comfortable with their own contradictions. Strength and vulnerability can exist together without conflict. Another effect emerges in the way a person perceives others. When someone has explored their own shadow, they become less shocked by the imperfections of those around them. They recognize that every person carries similar hidden territories. Maybe instead of reacting with immediate judgment, they respond with understanding. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it allows for a clearer view of the forces that shape human actions. Over time, shadow integration creates a remarkable form of inner stability. Emotions still arise, but they no longer appear as unpredictable intruders. They are recognized as signals carrying energy that can be directed toward purposeful action. The mind becomes less divided because fewer parts of the self remain hidden or rejected. The initiate therefore stops seeing darkness within themselves as something to eliminate. Darkness becomes a source of potential energy waiting to be understood. Just as night allows stars to become visible, the shadow reveals aspects of the self that daylight alone cannot show. In this way, the inner landscape becomes more complete. Light and shadow coexist within awareness, each contributing to a fuller understanding of what it means to be human. What once seemed threatening becomes a resource, quietly strengthening the individual who learns how to work with it. Among the symbols that have appeared across centuries of philosophical and spiritual traditions, few are as enduring as the square and the compasses. At first glance, they appear to be simple tools one used to measure right angles. The other used to draw circles. In practical life, they belong to builders and architects. Yet in symbolic traditions, these tools came to represent something far more profound. They describe the relationship between two dimensions of human existence, the material and the spiritual. The square represents the world of form. It symbolizes structure, action, behavior, and the practical responsibilities of daily life. The square reminds us that existence unfolds within the physical world, where decisions lead to consequences and ideas must eventually take shape through work. Every building stands on measured angles. Every bridge requires structural precision. The square, therefore, represents discipline, ethics, and the ability to act in alignment with principles that produce stability. The compasses represent a different dimension. While the square measures the external world, the compasses draw circles that originate from a single center point. In symbolic language, that center represents consciousness itself. The compasses therefore symbolize the inner world, thought, imagination, intention, and the capacity to reflect on existence, where the square anchors us to the ground of reality. The compasses remind us that human life also unfolds within the landscape of awareness. Many people unconsciously emphasize one of these dimensions while neglecting the other. Some individuals devote themselves entirely to material pursuits. Their focus remains fixed on productivity, to achievement, and measurable results. They may build careers, accumulate resources, and construct impressive external structures. Yet if attention remains exclusively on the square, something inside begins to feel incomplete. Without reflection, action can become mechanical. Success may arrive without clarity about its meaning. Others move in the opposite direction. They become fascinated with ideas, philosophy, spirituality, or introspection. They explore the inner world of consciousness deeply. Yet if this exploration never connects with action, their understanding remains abstract. Insight that never touches the ground of reality struggles to influence the course of life. The compasses may draw beautiful circles of thought, but without the square, those circles never become structures that support real change. The initiate gradually learns that balance between these two forces is essential. Human life does not flourish when either dimension dominates completely. A meaningful life requires both grounded action and reflective awareness. The square provides the discipline needed to shape the external world. The compasses provide the perspective needed to understand why those actions matter. Consider how these forces interact in daily experience. Imagine someone pursuing a goal with relentless focus on results alone. They work constantly, measuring progress through external achievements. At first, this intensity may produce success, yet without reflection, the person may eventually lose sight of their deeper motivations. The activity continues, but the meaning behind it fades. Burnout often emerges in such conditions because the inner dimension has been neglected. Now imagine someone who spends years studying philosophy, meditation, or spiritual insight without applying that understanding to practical life. They accumulate knowledge and speak eloquently about ideas, yet their daily habits remain unchanged. Opportunities pass without action. The insight remains confined to thought rather than shaping behavior. In this case, the inner dimension expands while the outer structure remains undeveloped. The symbol of the square and compasses invites a different approach. It suggests that the most stable life emerges when the two dimensions guide each other. Reflection informs action, and action tests reflection. The initiate learns to move between these modes fluidly. Time spent in contemplation clarifies direction. Time spent in disciplined work translates that clarity into reality. In many traditions, the compasses are depicted resting above the square. This arrangement carries symbolic meaning. It suggests that awareness should guide action rather than the other way around. When the inner world of understanding leads, the structures created in the external world tend to align more closely with purpose. The person acts deliberately rather than reactively. This relationship also introduces a sense of ethical responsibility. The square reminds the individual that actions affect the world around them. Every decision contributes to the structure of relationships, communities, and environments. Awareness alone is not enough. Behavior must reflect the principles that awareness reveals. Balancing these forces also changes the experience of success and failure. When someone operates only within the material dimension, success may appear as the ultimate validation, while failure feels like personal defeat. Yet when awareness participates in the process, both outcomes become sources of information. Success reveals what structures are effective. Failure reveals where understanding needs refinement. Neither event defines the person entirely. Over time, the initiate begins to see life itself as a form of architecture. Every habit becomes a building block. Every decision shapes the direction of the structure. Reflection provides the blueprint, while disciplined action assembles the materials. The quality of the final structure depends on the harmony between these elements. This architectural perspective encourages patience. Great buildings are not constructed in a single moment. Foundations must be prepared carefully before walls can rise. Similarly, a balanced life develops gradually through consistent attention to both inner understanding and external practice. Each day offers opportunities to refine that balance slightly. There are moments when the square must take the lead, when action is required despite uncertainty. There are other moments when the compasses must guide the way, when reflection prevents action from becoming misguided. The art lies in recognizing which mode is needed at a particular time. Through this ongoing balance, the individual gradually builds a life that is both grounded and meaningful. Work becomes connected to purpose. Reflection becomes connected to responsibility. The two dimensions no longer compete. They support one another. The square anchors awareness in the reality of the present world. The compasses remind awareness that every action originates from an inner center. Between these two symbols, a quiet equilibrium begins to form, shaping a way of living where thought and action move together with steady alignment. Every path of self-mastery unfolds through recognizable stages, though most people move through life without realizing they are passing through them. These stages do not belong to any single tradition, religion, or philosophy. They appear in many forms across different cultures because they describe a pattern that naturally emerges when a human being begins to observe the workings of their own mind. The journey from unconscious living to conscious direction rarely happens in a single step. It develops gradually through three distinct phases of awareness. The first stage can be described as unconscious identification with the external world. In this stage, a person experiences life almost entirely through reaction. Thoughts appear and are accepted immediately as truth. Emotions rise and automatically guide behavior. Circumstances determine mood, and the individual often feels as though events are happening to them rather than through them. Success may bring confidence, while failure produces discouragement. Approval creates satisfaction, while criticism creates doubt. Most people spend a large portion of their lives operating within this first stage, and there is nothing inherently wrong with it. It represents the natural beginning of human development. The mind learns by reacting to experience, gathering impressions from the surrounding environment. Yet this stage has a limitation. Because awareness is closely fused with thoughts and emotions, the individual rarely pauses to question them. If anger appears, the person becomes anger. If fear appears, they become fear. The reaction and the identity feel indistinguishable. Over time, however, certain moments begin to interrupt this automatic pattern. Perhaps a difficult experience creates an unexpected pause. Perhaps a period of reflection reveals patterns that were previously invisible. Gradually, a subtle shift begins to occur. The individual starts to notice that thoughts and emotions can be observed rather than immediately acted upon. This recognition marks the beginning of the second stage. The second stage can be described as conscious observation. Here, the individual begins to step slightly outside the constant flow of reactions. Thoughts still arise, and emotions still appear, but something new accompanies them: awareness. The person recognizes that a thought is occurring rather than assuming it represents absolute truth. They notice an emotional response forming before it completely dominates behavior. This stage introduces a quiet but profound change. Once observation enters the experience, the mind is no longer entirely on autopilot. A small distance emerges between stimulus and response. Inside that distance lies the possibility of choice. Instead of reacting immediately, the individual can pause. They can examine the situation, consider alternatives, and respond with greater intention. During this stage, many people become fascinated with understanding the mechanics of the mind. They study psychology, philosophy, or spiritual traditions that explore consciousness. They experiment with practices such as reflection, meditation, or journaling. These activities strengthen the ability to observe thoughts and emotions without becoming lost in them. However, the second stage also presents its own challenges. Observation alone does not automatically produce transformation. A person may become highly aware of their patterns, yet still struggle to change them consistently. They may recognize habits that limit their progress while feeling uncertain about how to move beyond them. This stage can sometimes feel like standing at the edge of understanding without fully stepping into it. With continued practice, a deeper shift gradually begins to unfold. Observation evolves into something more active. Awareness no longer simply watches the mind, it begins guiding it. This transition marks the beginning of the third stage of inner mastery. The third stage can be described as conscious direction. At this level, the individual recognizes that attention itself is a powerful force. Instead of allowing thoughts to move randomly, they learn to direct their focus deliberately. Instead of being pulled by every emotional wave, they choose how to interpret experiences and how to respond to them. This stage does not eliminate challenges or difficult emotions. Human experience remains complex, yet the relationship with those experiences changes dramatically. Fear may still appear, but it no longer dictates every decision. Doubt may arise, yet it is examined rather than automatically believed. The individual becomes the navigator of their inner landscape rather than a passenger carried by it. Conscious direction also strengthens the connection between intention and action. The person begins setting goals that reflect deeper values rather than momentary impulses. They organize their environment, habits, and routines to support those intentions. Gradually, their external life begins to mirror the clarity developing within their mind. Another quality emerges during this stage: stability. Because attention is no longer scattered by every distraction, energy becomes concentrated. Work gains depth. Relationships become more deliberate. Even moments of rest carry a sense of presence rather than unconscious escape. Life feels less fragmented because awareness remains centered more consistently. The three stages of inner mastery do not function like rigid levels that a person completes once and never revisits. Movement between them can occur repeatedly. In moments of stress or uncertainty, even someone who has developed strong awareness may temporarily slip back into automatic reactions. Yet each return to observation becomes easier because the path has already been discovered. Understanding these stages also brings patience to the process of growth. Many people expect immediate transformation once they begin exploring self-awareness. When change does not occur instantly, they assume something is wrong. Recognizing that development moves through phases helps remove this unnecessary pressure. Each stage plays a necessary role in shaping the next. The first stage provides experience. The second stage provides understanding. The third stage provides direction. Together they form a cycle through which consciousness gradually becomes more intentional. Over time, the individual learns to recognize where they stand within this cycle at any given moment. This awareness itself becomes a form of mastery. Instead of judging themselves harshly when old patterns appear, the initiate simply notices them and returns to observation. Instead of expecting perfection, they continue refining the relationship between attention and action. Gradually, the distance between awareness and reaction grows wider. In that widening space, the individual discovers something that had always been present, but rarely noticed: the ability to guide their own inner world with clarity and steadiness. Long before modern psychology began studying the influence of language on thought, ancient traditions were already pointing toward a remarkable idea. Words are not merely tools for communication, they are instruments of creation. The language a person uses, both spoken aloud and silently within the mind, gradually shapes the structure of their experience. Every sentence becomes more than a description of reality. It becomes a subtle instruction directing how the mind interprets the world. Many people underestimate this influence because language feels ordinary. Words flow continuously through daily conversation, through internal dialogue, through the constant commentary running in the background of thought. Because this process happens automatically, its impact often remains invisible. Yet if you observe carefully, you begin to notice that the mind tends to organize itself around the words it repeatedly hears and speaks. Consider how a simple phrase can influence perception. When someone says, "I always fail," the mind begins searching for evidence that confirms the statement. Memories of past mistakes rise quickly, while moments of success fade into the background. If the phrase changes slightly, "I am learning from every attempt," the same experiences begin to appear differently. Failure transforms into information rather than identity. The external events may remain identical, yet the internal interpretation shifts dramatically. Ancient teachings often referred to this phenomenon as the creative word. The idea was not that words magically change the physical world by themselves, but that language directs the movement of attention. Attention then influences behavior, decisions, and emotional responses. Over time, those patterns accumulate into the circumstances that shape a person's life. The initiate becomes deeply aware of this relationship between language and perception. Instead of allowing words to flow carelessly, they begin listening closely to the sentences they repeat each day. Certain phrases appear again and again. "I can't do that. Things never work out for me. People like me don't succeed in those situations." These statements may sound harmless, yet each one quietly programs the mind to expect limitations. Once this pattern is recognized, something important becomes clear. Language does not only describe identity, it reinforces it. The words a person uses about themselves gradually become the boundaries of what they believe is possible. If someone constantly defines themselves through weakness, uncertainty, or failure, their mind begins filtering reality through that lens. Changing this process does not require exaggerated positivity or unrealistic declarations. Instead, it begins with awareness and precision. The initiate chooses words that align with growth rather than restriction. Instead of saying, "I am terrible at this," they might say, "I am still developing this skill." Instead of declaring, "This situation is impossible," they may acknowledge, "This challenge requires new understanding." These subtle adjustments reshape the internal narrative. The mind becomes more open to solutions because language no longer traps it inside rigid conclusions. Over time, this shift encourages experimentation, persistence, and curiosity, qualities that expand the range of possible outcomes. Another important dimension of the creative word appears in conversations with others. Words carry emotional energy. A sentence spoken carelessly can weaken trust or create misunderstanding. A thoughtful sentence can encourage confidence and clarity. People often remember the tone and meaning of words long after the exact phrasing has faded. Because of this influence, the initiate treats language as a responsibility rather than a casual habit. Before speaking, they consider whether the words they are about to use will contribute to clarity or confusion. They recognize that communication is not only about expressing thoughts, but also about shaping the emotional atmosphere in which those thoughts are received. This awareness also transforms the way the initiate listens. When someone else speaks, they pay attention not only to the information being shared, but also to the language patterns behind it. Repeated phrases reveal beliefs that may not be immediately obvious. Statements about limitations, expectations, or identity often expose the assumptions guiding a person's decisions. Listening carefully allows the initiate to respond more effectively. Instead of arguing against a person's beliefs directly, they may introduce new language that invites a different perspective. A single well-chosen sentence can sometimes shift the direction of an entire conversation. Perhaps the most powerful form of language, however, is the one that occurs silently inside the mind. Internal dialogue accompanies almost every moment of life. When facing a challenge, the mind immediately begins commenting, "This will be difficult. I might fail. What if this goes wrong?" These thoughts appear quickly and often go unquestioned. Yet internal language functions just like spoken language. It influences emotional responses and guides behavior. When the mind repeatedly predicts failure, hesitation grows stronger. When the mind expects progress, effort tends to increase. The initiate therefore becomes attentive to this internal conversation. They do not attempt to silence every thought, which would be unrealistic. Instead, they learn to recognize when language begins shaping perception in unhelpful ways. When a limiting statement appears internally, they examine it calmly. Is this sentence describing reality accurately, or is it merely repeating an old assumption? Gradually, the internal dialogue becomes more constructive. Challenges are acknowledged without exaggeration. Possibilities are considered without fantasy. The mind begins operating with a language that encourages movement rather than paralysis. Over time, this shift influences how a person interacts with the world. Words guide attention. Attention guides action, and action shapes results. The transformation may appear subtle from the outside, yet internally the experience becomes very different. The individual no longer feels trapped inside rigid narratives about what they can or cannot become. Language continues to function as a creative force, quietly shaping perception with every sentence that passes through awareness. The initiate simply becomes conscious of this process and learns to work with it deliberately, allowing words to support clarity rather than limit it. There are two simple words that appear constantly in human language, yet their influence on the direction of a life is often overlooked. Those words are "I am." At first they seem ordinary, nothing more than a grammatical structure used to describe identity. Yet if you observe carefully, you begin to notice that almost every belief a person holds about themselves begins with this phrase: "I am capable. I am unlucky. I am confident. I am not good enough." The mind quietly attaches meaning to these statements until they become the foundation of personal identity. The power of this phrase lies in the way the mind treats it. When someone says, "I am," the brain interprets the words that follow, not as temporary descriptions, but as definitions. The sentence becomes a statement about what the person believes themselves to be. Over time, these statements accumulate and form a self-image that begins guiding behavior automatically. Imagine a person who repeatedly says, "I am terrible at learning new things." Even if this statement began as a joke or a moment of frustration, repetition gradually strengthens the belief behind it. When the person encounters a new challenge, the mind recalls that identity, effort decreases before the attempt even begins. Mistakes confirm the belief, while successes may be dismissed as accidents. Eventually, the person genuinely feels as though the statement reflects an unchangeable truth. Now imagine the opposite pattern. A person who says, "I am someone who learns quickly," approaches the same challenge with a different internal framework. Mistakes become part of the learning process rather than evidence of limitation. Effort increases because the identity supports persistence. The external challenge remains the same, yet the experience of it changes completely because the identity guiding the mind is different. This illustrates an important principle. Identity often determines behavior long before circumstances reveal what is actually possible. The mind tends to act in ways that protect the story it believes about itself. If someone identifies as disciplined, they are more likely to maintain habits that reinforce that image. If someone identifies as easily distracted, their attention may drift even when they genuinely wish to focus. Ancient philosophical traditions understood the influence of identity long before modern psychology began studying it scientifically. They recognized that the words following "I am" function like instructions given to the subconscious mind. When repeated consistently, these instructions shape perception, expectations, and actions. The initiate, therefore, pays careful attention to how identity is defined internally. Instead of allowing old assumptions to dictate the story, they examine the beliefs attached to the phrase "I am." Some of these beliefs may have been formed years earlier, during moments of emotional intensity. A single negative experience may have created an identity that continued influencing behavior long after the event itself was forgotten. For example, a student who once struggled publicly with a difficult subject might quietly adopt the identity, "I am bad at this." That identity may persist into adulthood, shaping decisions about career paths, learning opportunities, and personal confidence. Yet, when examined carefully, the belief may reveal itself as a conclusion formed from a very limited set of experiences. Recognizing this process does not require denying past experiences or pretending that difficulties never occurred. Instead, it invites a different question. Is the identity being repeated still useful? Does it support growth? Or does it quietly restrict what the mind is willing to attempt? When the initiate begins exploring this question, they often discover that identity is more flexible than it originally appeared. The mind can learn to redefine itself gradually through conscious repetition of new beliefs. This does not happen instantly. Identity changes through consistent reinforcement. Much like any other mental pattern, the process begins by choosing statements that reflect the direction of growth rather than the limitations of the past. Instead of declaring an unrealistic transformation overnight, the initiate introduces identities that encourage progress. I am someone who improves through practice. I am becoming more focused each day. I am capable of understanding complex ideas when I give them time. These statements may feel unfamiliar at first because they challenge old narratives, yet with repetition they begin to influence the way the mind approaches experience. When challenges appear, the identity supports effort rather than hesitation. Gradually, actions begin aligning with the new belief. Another important aspect of identity emerges in moments when no one else is present. During quiet moments, the internal dialogue reveals the beliefs a person holds most deeply. If the mind constantly criticizes itself with phrases like "I am not enough," confidence becomes fragile. When the internal voice changes to something more constructive, emotional resilience begins to strengthen. The initiate, therefore, treats self-talk with the same care they would use when speaking to someone they respect. Harsh internal criticism rarely produces growth. It often creates avoidance and discouragement. Encouraging language, on the other hand, supports persistence even when progress feels slow. Over time, identity becomes less about fixed labels and more about direction. Instead of defining themselves through rigid categories, the initiate begins seeing identity as a dynamic process. The phrase "I am" becomes a statement of alignment with certain values and behaviors rather than a permanent description. This shift creates a surprising sense of freedom. If identity can evolve, then mistakes no longer define the future permanently. A person can acknowledge past actions without being imprisoned by them. Growth becomes possible because the story guiding behavior is no longer fixed. At the same time, this awareness brings responsibility. Because identity influences behavior so strongly, the beliefs attached to "I am" must be chosen carefully. Every repeated statement gradually shapes the structure of perception. The initiate, therefore, uses this phrase deliberately, understanding that each time it is spoken or thought, it quietly reinforces the direction in which the mind is moving. In this way, the simple phrase "I am" becomes more than a grammatical expression. It becomes the foundation upon which identity organizes itself, quietly guiding how a person interprets experience and how they step forward into the unfolding of their life. Throughout many ancient cultures, there appears a mysterious symbol that has fascinated human imagination for centuries: the phoenix. According to legend, this mythical bird lives for a long cycle of time, and when that cycle reaches its end, it does not simply die in the ordinary sense. Instead, the phoenix bursts into flame and turns to ash. From those ashes, a new phoenix rises, renewed and alive once again. The story is not merely a myth about a magical creature. It is a symbolic description of one of the deepest processes that occurs within human transformation, the death of an old identity so that a new one can emerge. Most people imagine personal change as something that happens gradually, without requiring the disappearance of what came before. They hope to add new habits, new beliefs, or new goals while keeping their old identity intact. Yet when you observe the moments in life where true transformation occurs, a different pattern becomes visible. Something about the old way of living must end before a new direction can fully take shape. The phoenix does not become stronger by simply decorating its old feathers. It becomes new by passing through the fire. In psychological terms, the death of the old self does not mean losing one's personality or becoming someone entirely different overnight. It means recognizing that certain beliefs, habits, and identities have reached the end of their usefulness. They once served a purpose, perhaps protecting the mind during earlier stages of life. Yet if they remain unchanged, they begin to limit growth. Consider the identities that many people carry unconsciously for years. Someone may see themselves as the person who avoids risk. Another may believe they are always the one who sacrifices their own goals for others. Someone else may define themselves as the person who struggles, who never quite reaches the level they desire. These identities often become comfortable because they are familiar. Even when they cause frustration, the mind hesitates to release them because they feel like part of who we are. The Phoenix Principle invites a different perspective. It suggests that identity is not meant to remain fixed forever. Just as seasons change and landscapes evolve, the human mind also moves through cycles. Certain identities belong to one stage of life but not to the next. When growth begins pressing against the boundaries of an old identity, tension appears. The person senses that something must change, yet they may not know exactly how. This moment of tension is often experienced as discomfort or uncertainty. Old habits no longer feel satisfying, yet new patterns have not fully formed. Many people attempt to escape this feeling quickly, returning to familiar behaviors because they provide temporary stability. Yet the initiate recognizes this tension as the beginning of transformation. The fire of the phoenix is symbolic of this uncomfortable phase. Fire represents the process of burning away what no longer belongs in the next stage of development. Old beliefs are questioned. Long-held assumptions are examined carefully. Certain relationships, routines, or environments may change as new priorities emerge. None of these shifts happen instantly. The process unfolds gradually, often accompanied by moments of doubt. During this phase, it may feel as though the ground beneath one's identity is dissolving. The person may ask questions they have never asked before. If I am no longer the person I believed myself to be, then who am I becoming? This uncertainty is not a sign that something is wrong. It is evidence that the transformation has begun. In many traditions, this stage is described as a period of inner alchemy. Just as raw materials must be heated and reshaped to form something stronger, the mind passes through a similar refinement. The qualities that once defined the person are broken apart and reorganized. Some traits disappear entirely. Others remain but take on new meaning. For example, someone who once avoided risk may discover that their caution was not weakness, but a form of careful observation. When combined with courage, that same quality becomes strategic thinking. A person who spent years putting others first may realize that compassion can coexist with clear boundaries. What once appeared as sacrifice becomes balanced generosity. This transformation does not erase the past. The experiences that formed the earlier identity remain valuable because they contributed to the understanding that now makes change possible. The ashes of the phoenix symbolize these experiences. They are not wasted. They become the foundation from which something new rises. Another important aspect of the Phoenix Principle is the recognition that transformation is cyclical. Life rarely contains only one moment of rebirth. As individuals continue growing, new identities eventually reach their own limits. A person who once reinvented themselves successfully may later discover that another transformation is necessary. Each cycle refines awareness further. Because of this, the initiate learns not to fear these moments of transition. When old patterns begin to dissolve, they recognize the familiar signs of the phoenix process. Confusion may appear briefly, but beneath that confusion lies the quiet preparation for a new stage of clarity. Over time, this understanding creates resilience. Instead of clinging desperately to identities that have already served their purpose, the individual becomes more willing to evolve. They understand that personal growth sometimes requires letting go of versions of themselves that once felt essential. This does not happen through force or sudden rejection of the past. It happens through awareness. As understanding deepens, certain behaviors simply lose their appeal. Beliefs that once felt convincing no longer seem accurate. The old identity begins fading naturally because the mind has outgrown it. Gradually, the new identity takes shape. It may begin quietly, through small decisions that reflect a different perspective. New habits replace old ones. New goals emerge. The person may notice that their reactions to familiar situations are no longer the same as before. What once triggered fear now invites curiosity. What once produced hesitation now encourages movement. From the outside, these changes may appear subtle, yet internally something significant has occurred. The individual no longer sees themselves through the same lens. The story that once defined their limits has been rewritten. The phoenix does not announce its rebirth with dramatic declarations. It simply rises from the ashes and continues its flight, carrying within it the memory of every cycle that shaped its transformation. There are moments in life when everything that once felt stable suddenly begins to shift. Plans fail. Relationships change. A path that once seemed clear becomes uncertain. These moments are often described with a single word: crisis. Most people see crisis as something purely negative, an interruption of the life they hope to maintain. Yet throughout history, many of the most profound transformations have begun precisely at these points of disruption. A crisis exposes what ordinary life often hides. During calm periods, routines carry us forward almost automatically. Habits operate quietly. Beliefs remain unchallenged. And identity feels stable because circumstances rarely question it. But when a crisis appears, the structures that supported that identity begin to shake. Situations arise that cannot be solved with the same patterns that once worked. The mind is forced to confront the possibility that the way it has been thinking may no longer be sufficient. This confrontation can feel uncomfortable, even frightening. When familiar structures collapse, uncertainty replaces predictability. Many people respond by trying to restore the past as quickly as possible. They search for ways to rebuild the same life they had before the disruption occurred. Yet sometimes the deeper opportunity of a crisis lies in recognizing that the old structure cannot simply be restored. Something new must emerge. Ancient traditions often describe this process as a form of inner rebirth. Just as the phoenix symbolized the burning away of an outdated identity, crisis represents the moment when life itself introduces the fire. It interrupts routine and forces the individual to reconsider who they are, what they value, and how they wish to move forward. This does not mean that crisis is pleasant or easy. In fact, it often brings emotional intensity. Doubt may appear where confidence once existed. Questions may replace certainty. A person may feel temporarily lost between two versions of themselves, the one they used to be and the one that has not yet fully formed. Yet within this uncertainty lies a powerful possibility. When the old identity becomes unstable, the mind gains an unusual degree of flexibility. Beliefs that once felt permanent are suddenly open to examination. Habits that once seemed automatic can be reconsidered. The individual begins asking deeper questions about the direction of their life. During these moments, people often discover strengths they did not realize they possessed. A challenge that initially appears overwhelming gradually reveals hidden reserves of resilience. Skills that were never tested before begin to emerge. The mind learns that it is capable of adapting to conditions it once believed impossible. This discovery does not happen all at once. It unfolds step by step as the person navigates the unfamiliar landscape created by the crisis. Each decision becomes an experiment in a new way of living. Some choices lead to mistakes, while others reveal surprising progress. Slowly, the person begins constructing a different understanding of themselves. An important shift occurs during this process. At the beginning of a crisis, attention is often focused on what has been lost. The mind repeatedly returns to the question of how things could have been different. Over time, however, the focus begins to change. The individual starts asking what can be learned from the experience. Instead of trying to recreate the past exactly as it was, they begin exploring what the future might become. This shift marks the beginning of inner rebirth. The person stops defining themselves only through what happened to them. Instead, they begin defining themselves through how they respond to it. The crisis becomes part of their story, but it no longer controls the direction of the narrative. Many people who pass through significant challenges later describe a surprising realization. While they would never choose to repeat the painful circumstances, they recognize that those experiences reshaped their perspective in valuable ways. They gained clarity about what truly matters. They developed patience, resilience, and empathy that might never have appeared under easier conditions. This does not mean that crisis is necessary for growth, but it often accelerates the process. It removes illusions and forces the mind to engage with reality more directly. When a person begins rebuilding after a disruption, they often do so with greater awareness than before. The initiate approaches crisis with this understanding in mind. Instead of seeing it only as an obstacle, they recognize it as a moment when life is asking deeper questions. What beliefs must be re-examined? What habits must change? What direction now feels aligned with a clearer sense of purpose? These questions rarely produce immediate answers. They require reflection and patience. Yet, gradually the individual begins forming a new internal structure. This structure is often stronger than the one that existed before the crisis, because it has been built with greater awareness. Another interesting transformation occurs during this process. The fear of future uncertainty begins to lose its power. Once a person has navigated a significant disruption, they understand that identity is not as fragile as they once believed. They have seen themselves adapt, learn, and continue moving forward, even when circumstances change dramatically. This realization creates a quiet confidence. Life may still contain unexpected events, but the individual now trusts their capacity to respond to them. Stability no longer depends entirely on external conditions. It emerges from the ability to remain centered even when the environment shifts. Over time, the memory of the crisis becomes integrated into the larger story of personal development. What once felt like a rupture gradually appears as a turning point. The path before and the path after reveal two different versions of the same life. Inner rebirth rarely arrives with dramatic announcements. It appears gradually as new habits replace old ones, new perspectives reshape understanding, and a different sense of identity begins guiding decisions. The person who emerges from the experience may look similar from the outside, yet internally the architecture of their thinking has changed. Crisis, when viewed from this perspective, becomes less like an ending and more like a passage. It represents the moment when an old structure dissolves and the foundations of something new begin quietly forming beneath the surface of awareness. Among the many symbolic images used throughout ancient philosophical traditions, one of the most unusual is the pelican. In medieval symbolism, the pelican was often depicted piercing its own breast to feed its young with its blood. At first glance, the image appears dramatic, even strange, yet the meaning behind it was never meant to be literal. It represented a deeper idea about life itself, the principle that energy, knowledge, and abundance must circulate in order to remain alive. Life everywhere follows the pattern of circulation. Blood moves continuously through the body, carrying oxygen and nutrients that sustain every organ. Water travels through rivers, clouds, and oceans in an endless cycle of evaporation and return. Even the air moves constantly, circulating through the atmosphere so that life can breathe. When circulation stops, systems begin to decay. Movement is what keeps life vibrant. Human experience follows the same pattern. Ideas grow stronger when they are shared. Skills improve when they are used to contribute to something larger. Resources that remain stagnant often lose their value over time. Yet many people approach life as if abundance must be held tightly and protected from circulation. They fear that giving away time, knowledge, or generosity will somehow reduce what they possess. The pelican principle suggests the opposite. It proposes that growth and vitality often increase when what we have is allowed to flow outward. Giving does not always mean material sacrifice. It includes sharing understanding, offering encouragement, creating opportunities, and contributing effort towards something meaningful. When these forms of giving occur, the individual becomes part of a larger movement of exchange. Consider the way knowledge spreads. When someone learns a valuable insight but keeps it entirely to themselves, the benefit remains limited. When that insight is shared with others, it begins influencing more than one mind. Conversations develop, ideas evolve, new perspectives appear. The original knowledge does not disappear through sharing, it expands. The same dynamic appears in creativity. Artists, writers, teachers, and innovators often discover that their abilities grow stronger when they contribute their work to others. Feedback refines skill. Interaction sparks new inspiration. What began as a private ability becomes something that enriches a wider community. The initiate gradually recognizes that life does not operate according to a static model of possession. It functions through movement. When energy flows freely, new energy often enters the system. When attention and effort are directed toward helping others grow, unexpected opportunities frequently appear in return. These outcomes are not mystical rewards, they are natural consequences of participation in networks of exchange. Another important aspect of the Pelican Principle involves the transformation of perspective. When someone focuses exclusively on personal gain, their attention narrows. Every situation is evaluated according to what it provides for them alone. This perspective can create constant tension because life rarely delivers perfect conditions for individual satisfaction. When attention expands to include contribution, the experience of life changes. Instead of measuring every interaction through personal advantage, the individual begins asking how their presence can improve a situation. This shift does not eliminate personal ambition or goals. Rather, it integrates those ambitions into a broader context where success includes the well-being of others. Generosity in this sense is not weakness. It is a form of strength rooted in confidence. A person who believes resources are scarce may feel the need to protect everything they have. A person who understands the power of circulation recognizes that giving often strengthens the entire environment in which they live. This principle can be observed in relationships as well. When trust, encouragement, and attention circulate between people, connections deepen naturally. When these elements are withheld, relationships tend to weaken over time. The health of any community depends on the willingness of individuals to contribute something meaningful to one another. Yet the Pelican Principle also contains an important balance. Giving must arise from genuine alignment rather than self-neglect. If a person constantly sacrifices their own well-being without awareness, exhaustion eventually replaces generosity. True circulation requires that energy moves in both directions. Contribution should strengthen the giver as well as the receiver. The initiate therefore practices thoughtful generosity. They share what they can offer while maintaining the clarity needed to sustain their own growth. This balance ensures that giving remains a source of vitality rather than depletion. Another subtle effect appears when this principle becomes part of everyday life. The individual begins noticing opportunities to contribute in places where they previously saw none. A conversation becomes a chance to offer insight. A challenge becomes an opportunity to assist someone facing a similar situation. Even small actions, kind words, patient listening, thoughtful guidance begin to carry significance. These contributions rarely produce immediate recognition. Often they move quietly through the lives of others in ways that remain unseen. Yet over time they shape the atmosphere surrounding the individual. People naturally gravitate toward those who bring clarity, encouragement, and generosity into their interactions. In this way, circulation expands beyond material exchange. It becomes an exchange of influence, perspective, and inspiration. The person who participates in this flow becomes part of a larger network where ideas, opportunities, and relationships move continuously between individuals. The symbol of the pelican therefore represents more than sacrifice. It represents the recognition that life thrives through movement. Just as rivers remain healthy by flowing rather than standing still, human potential grows when it participates in the ongoing exchange that connects individuals to one another. Through this understanding, the initiate begins to see their abilities not only as personal assets, but as resources capable of contributing to something wider. Knowledge, creativity, effort, and attention all become forms of energy that can circulate beyond the boundaries of the self. When this circulation becomes natural, life gradually begins reflecting the same pattern. Opportunities arrive through relationships that were strengthened by generosity. Ideas develop through conversations that were once shared freely. Progress appears not as isolated success, but as a movement that includes many people along the way. The Pelican Principle quietly reminds the observer that nothing in life truly flourishes through isolation. Growth often reveals itself most clearly when what we carry within us is allowed to move outward into the larger current of human experience. At some point in every journey of inner development, a quiet but powerful realization begins to emerge. Much of what has shaped a person's life was accepted without conscious examination. Beliefs about success, failure, identity, morality, ambition, and limitation often arrive through family, culture, education, or social expectations long before the individual ever questioned them. These influences form a framework that guides decisions almost automatically. Yet the moment awareness begins examining this framework carefully, a new possibility appears, the possibility of sovereignty. Sovereignty, in its deepest sense, does not refer to political power or dominance over others. It refers to the ability to govern one's own mind. A sovereign individual recognizes that their thoughts, beliefs, and choices do not need to be dictated entirely by external forces. They understand that although the world may present endless opinions, pressures, and expectations, the final authority over interpretation belongs within their own awareness. Many people live without ever fully claiming this authority. They move through life reacting to the expectations placed upon them. When others approve, they feel secure. When others criticize, they begin doubting their direction. Their sense of identity rises and falls depending on external validation. In such a state, authority over the inner world has been quietly transferred to the outside environment. The initiate begins to notice this pattern early in the path of self-mastery. They observe how easily the mind absorbs opinions from others and converts them into internal rules. A comment from a teacher may become a lifelong belief about intelligence. A moment of failure may become an identity that defines future effort. Even the subtle expectations of society can shape what a person believes is acceptable to pursue. Reclaiming sovereignty begins with questioning these inherited narratives. The individual asks, which of these beliefs truly belong to me, and which was simply adopted without reflection? This question does not lead to immediate rebellion against every influence. Instead, it creates space for thoughtful evaluation. For example, someone may have been told throughout life that stability is more important than curiosity. As a result, they might avoid exploring interests that appear uncertain. When sovereignty begins emerging, they examine this belief directly. Is stability always more valuable than exploration? Or might both qualities have a place depending on the circumstances? Through this process, the individual begins separating internal conviction from external expectation. Some beliefs prove valuable and remain part of their guiding principles. Others lose their authority once examined in the light of awareness. Gradually, the mind becomes less dependent on automatic acceptance of outside judgments. Another aspect of sovereignty involves responsibility. When a person recognizes that they possess the authority to shape their interpretations, they can no longer place full responsibility for their life on external circumstances. Situations may still present challenges, limitations, or unexpected difficulties, yet the individual acknowledges that their response to those situations remains within their control. This shift can feel uncomfortable at first because it removes the familiar refuge of blame. It is easier to attribute dissatisfaction entirely to external conditions than to examine one's own patterns of decision-making. Sovereignty requires honesty. The initiate must recognize where their own choices, habits, or beliefs contributed to the outcomes they experience. Yet, this honesty also produces empowerment. When responsibility is reclaimed, possibility expands. If the mind played a role in shaping past experiences, it can also influence the direction of future ones. The individual becomes an active participant in the unfolding of their life, rather than a passive observer. Personal authority also transforms the relationship with uncertainty. When someone relies heavily on external validation, Uncertainty becomes threatening because approval from others cannot be guaranteed. A sovereign individual, however, understands that inner direction provides a more stable compass. Decisions are guided by reflection, values, and careful observation rather than the shifting opinions of the crowd. This does not mean ignoring advice or rejecting collaboration. Wisdom often grows through dialogue with others. Sovereignty simply ensures that the final decision arises from conscious evaluation rather than blind conformity. The individual listens carefully to different perspectives, then chooses their path with clarity. Boundaries become another important expression of sovereignty. Without clear boundaries, the expectations and demands of others easily overwhelm personal priorities. A sovereign individual learns to protect time, attention, and energy so that their actions remain aligned with their chosen direction. Saying no when necessary becomes part of maintaining this alignment. These boundaries are not acts of hostility toward others. They are expressions of self-respect. By preserving the space needed for reflection and purposeful action, the individual ensures that their life continues moving according to deliberate intention rather than constant reaction. Over time, the practice of sovereignty reshapes how a person interacts with the world. External events still occur, yet they no longer dictate internal stability in the same way. Praise and criticism are received with awareness but do not entirely determine self-worth. Success brings satisfaction without arrogance, while failure becomes information rather than condemnation. This internal steadiness gradually produces a quiet confidence. The individual understands that while they cannot control every circumstance, they can control how they interpret those circumstances and how they respond to them. Their identity no longer depends solely on outcomes. It rests on the integrity of the choices they make. Interestingly, this form of authority often leads to greater harmony with others rather than conflict. When people operate from clear self-understanding, their interactions become more honest and consistent. They are less likely to manipulate or conform excessively because their direction is already defined internally. In this sense, sovereignty does not isolate the individual from the world. It allows them to participate in it more authentically. Decisions arise from alignment rather than pressure. Relationships develop through mutual respect rather than dependency. Gradually, the initiate realizes that sovereignty is not something granted by institutions, traditions, or external recognition. It is a state of awareness that emerges when the individual accepts responsibility for guiding their own mind. From that moment onward, life becomes a series of deliberate choices shaped by clarity, reflection, and personal authority. Most people experience time as a straight line. The past stretches behind them, filled with memories and events that cannot be changed. The future lies ahead, uncertain and full of possibilities or fears. Between these two directions sits the present moment, which often feels small and fleeting, like a narrow bridge connecting what has already happened with what has not yet arrived. Living with this perspective can create a constant sense of movement and pressure. The mind either drifts backward into memory or forward into anticipation, rarely remaining fully anchored in the moment where life is actually unfolding. Yet, throughout philosophy, mysticism, and even modern reflections on consciousness, another way of understanding time has quietly appeared. Instead of seeing time only as a horizontal line stretching from past to future, some traditions describe what could be called vertical time. In this view, the present moment is not merely a thin point passing quickly along a timeline. It is a deep dimension of experience, a place where awareness can access clarity, choice, and transformation. When people live entirely within the horizontal view of time, they often feel constrained by their past. Old experiences become fixed narratives that seem impossible to escape. A mistake made years ago may still shape how someone defines themselves today. A moment of success may create pressure to maintain the same image indefinitely. The past begins to feel like a weight that continues influencing the present, even though the events themselves are long gone. At the same time, the future can become a source of anxiety. The mind attempts to predict outcomes, solve problems that have not yet appeared, and control circumstances that remain uncertain. Thoughts move constantly between remembering and anticipating, leaving little space for awareness to experience what is happening right now. Vertical time invites a different relationship with experience. Instead of seeing the present moment as something that quickly disappears, it recognizes the present as the only place where consciousness truly operates. The past exists as memory within the mind. The future exists as imagination. Both are important, yet neither can be interacted with directly. Every decision, every perception, every action unfolds within the present. When awareness settles fully into the present, something subtle changes. The mind becomes less dominated by automatic stories about what has already happened or what might happen next. Instead, it begins responding to reality as it appears now. This does not erase the past or ignore the future, but it places them in their proper context. They become sources of information rather than forces that control the direction of life. The initiate learns to recognize how often the mind leaves the present moment without noticing. While working, attention may drift toward past conversations or imagined scenarios. During quiet moments, thoughts may replay old experiences repeatedly. Each time this happens, awareness gently returns to the present without judgment. This return does not require intense effort. It begins with simple observation, noticing the rhythm of breathing, the sensations of the body, the sounds in the surrounding environment. These details anchor attention in what is actually occurring. As the mind settles, the sense of pressure created by constant mental movement begins to ease. From this state of presence, decisions often become clearer. When the mind is overwhelmed by memories or projections, choices tend to be reactive. They are influenced by fear of repeating past mistakes or by the desire to control imagined futures. When awareness remains centered in the present, the individual can examine a situation more calmly and respond with greater clarity. Vertical time also changes the relationship with personal identity. Many people believe they must carry their past identity indefinitely because it has always been part of their story. Yet if identity is examined within the present moment, it reveals itself as something that can evolve. The past may explain how certain beliefs developed, but it does not permanently dictate who someone must remain. This realization creates freedom. If identity exists in the present rather than being permanently fixed in the past, then transformation becomes possible at any moment. A person who once believed they were limited by earlier experiences can begin redefining themselves through new choices made today. Each present moment becomes a point of creative potential rather than a continuation of old patterns. Another interesting effect of vertical time appears in the way people experience patience. When attention constantly rushes toward future outcomes, progress often feels slow and frustrating. The mind measures every step according to how far it still must travel. Yet when awareness remains rooted in the present, the process itself becomes meaningful. Each action receives full attention rather than being treated merely as a step toward something else. This perspective does not eliminate ambition or long-term goals. Instead, it changes how those goals are approached. The individual still plans and works toward future results, but their sense of stability no longer depends entirely on reaching them. Fulfillment becomes connected to the quality of attention brought to each moment of the journey. Vertical time also reveals something deeper about awareness itself. When the mind stops racing through memories and projections, a quiet sense of presence begins to appear. This presence is not tied to any particular event or thought. It is simply the awareness that observes everything happening in the moment. Some traditions describe this awareness as the center of consciousness, the place from which perception arises. When the initiate recognizes this center, they realize that stability does not need to come from external conditions. Even when circumstances change, the capacity to observe and respond remains steady. Life continues moving forward through time as usual. Days pass, events unfold, and the future gradually becomes the past. Yet, within this movement, the present moment reveals itself as more than a passing instant. It becomes a point of depth where awareness meets experience directly. In this depth, the individual discovers that clarity, choice, and transformation are always available, not somewhere in the distant future, but quietly within the moment that is already unfolding. In architecture, there is a special stone placed at the very top of an arch. It is called the keystone. At first glance, it may appear no different from the other stones surrounding it. yet its position gives it a unique role. Once the keystone is set in place, the entire structure becomes stable. The stones that once seemed separate now support each other, held together by a single point of balance. Without the keystone, the arch cannot hold its shape. In many philosophical traditions, the idea of the keystone appears as a symbol for the final realization in the journey of inner development. After a person passes through stages of discipline, self-observation, identity transformation, and conscious awareness, a deeper insight gradually begins to form. This insight is not merely intellectual, it is experiential. It reveals that the individual is not as separate from the universe as they once believed. For much of life, people experience themselves as isolated beings moving through a world of external objects and events. The mind creates a strong boundary between self and everything else. The body feels like the center of identity, while the rest of reality appears distant and independent. From this perspective, life becomes a constant effort to navigate external forces, to gain control over circumstances, or to defend against them. Yet as awareness deepens, this rigid separation begins to soften. The individual starts noticing that their thoughts, emotions, and perceptions are continuously interacting with the environment around them. The mind responds to conversations, surroundings, ideas, and experiences in ways that shape behavior and perception. At the same time, the individual's actions influence the world around them, affecting other people, situations, and outcomes. Gradually, a realization emerges. The boundary between self and universe is not as absolute as it once appeared. Human beings exist within a vast network of relationships and influences. Every breath depends on the atmosphere. Every thought arises within a brain shaped by countless experiences. Every decision contributes to the unfolding patterns of the world. This understanding does not erase individuality. Each person remains a unique expression of consciousness with their own experiences and perspective. Yet the initiate begins to sense that individuality exists within a larger whole rather than apart from it. The same universe that formed stars and galaxies also formed the atoms within the human body. The same forces that shape nature operate quietly within every living organism. When this realization settles into awareness, the way a person perceives life begins to shift. The struggle to dominate or control every circumstance gradually gives way to a sense of participation. Instead of seeing themselves as an isolated entity fighting against the world, the individual begins experiencing life as a process in which they are deeply involved. This shift also transforms the relationship with meaning. Many people search for meaning as if it was something hidden somewhere outside themselves, waiting to be discovered through achievement or recognition. The realization of unity suggests something different. Meaning emerges naturally when the individual recognizes their connection to the broader movement of existence. Actions begin to carry a different quality when they are seen as part of a larger whole. Work becomes more than personal advancement. It becomes contribution. Relationships become more than exchanges of convenience. They become connections within a shared experience of life. Even simpler moments, conversation, learning, creating begin to feel more significant because they are recognized as expressions of a larger process unfolding through many individuals at once. This realization also brings a certain humility. When someone understands that they are part of a vast and complex universe, the need to constantly defend the ego begins to soften. Success no longer needs to prove superiority, and failure no longer threatens identity in the same way. Both become events within a larger story rather than absolute definitions of personal worth. At the same time, unity does not remove responsibility. If anything, it deepens it. Recognizing the interconnected nature of life means understanding that every action influences more than just the individual performing it. Choices ripple outward through relationships, communities, and environments. Awareness of this interconnectedness encourages greater care in how one moves through the world. Another interesting effect appears when this perspective becomes stable. The constant search for external validation begins to lose its urgency. When identity is grounded in the awareness of being part of something larger, the approval or disapproval of others no longer carries the same weight. The individual can act according to values and understanding rather than constantly seeking confirmation. This does not lead to isolation from society. Instead, it often produces deeper engagement with it. When the fear of judgment decreases, people tend to contribute more freely. Creativity expands because expression no longer depends entirely on external acceptance. Relationships become more genuine because interaction is guided by authenticity rather than performance. The realization symbolized by the keystone does not arrive suddenly for most people. It develops gradually as the different lessons of self-mastery begin to connect with each other. Discipline stabilizes attention. Observation reveals patterns of thought. Identity becomes flexible. Presence anchors awareness in the moment. Contribution connects the individual with others. Eventually, these elements align in a way that reveals a larger perspective. Life is no longer experienced only as a series of personal events, but as part of an unfolding universe in which every individual plays a role. The keystone does not replace the other stones of the arch. It allows them to hold together. In the same way, the realization of unity does not erase the stages that came before it. It brings them into harmony, allowing discipline, awareness, identity, and purpose to function as parts of a single structure. From this perspective, the journey of inner development begins to resemble the construction of that arch. Each lesson adds another stone, shaping the path gradually. When the final understanding settles into place, the structure reveals its stability not as a finished monument, but as a living framework through which awareness continues exploring the vast landscape of existence.